Okay, I think everyone is in. Good morning. This is our morning session with Karen Preston, Standards of Practice for Life Care Planners, the 4th edition. I'm Tanya Owen. I'll be the moderator for the session. Just a little bit of housekeeping we want to do before Karen gets started. One, her PowerPoint is on the schedule, the main conference page, so feel free to download that and follow along if you'd like to. We will be taking questions throughout the session, so down at the bottom, your Q&A, feel free to include any information that you have for Karen that you either want to share or that you want her to address, and we will save those questions for about the last 10 minutes or so of the session, but go ahead and feel free to send us a question as you think of it. If you want to use the chat function, which lots of people are already doing, feel free to do that to communicate with each other. It's a little bit silly introducing Karen Preston. I think everybody knows Karen Preston by now, but she is a certified rehabilitation nurse. Karen has been at the front of the Standards of Practice for Life Care Planners for years, and I, for one, and I think everybody else would agree, is that we're really grateful that she's doing it again. She has been a fearless leader in this process. She keeps us on task in the work group, and it is a major undertaking for her to do this. Karen, rightly so, was awarded in 2007 the President's Award from the Association of Rehabilitation Nurses, and in 2014, through IALCP, she achieved a well-deserved Lifetime Achievement Award. So I'm going to turn this over to Karen. Again, feel free to send us any questions that you have. We'll hold them, but we will be getting them throughout this session. So Karen, it's all yours.
Hey, thank you, Tanya. And Tanya's been one of the committee members, and this has just been an awesome committee, so I'm going to introduce you to them. So first of all, the objectives that we are going to achieve today. But I want to start by giving you a refresher from the presentation that we did at the symposium last year, and then I'll bring you up to date. So just as a refresher, the 3rd edition of the Standards of Practice were first published in 2015. So it's been about 6 years, which is right on target for what's typical for how often standards of practice get updated by professional associations. We know that change is perpetual. There's always new things happening in our field, either stuff that we've changed internally or the world at large is putting changes upon us. So it's a continual process to update standards of practice that will probably never end. We put out the call for volunteers in May of 2020 to join, or April of 2020 to join the committee. We had approximately 50 volunteers, never turned down a volunteer. They self-divided into 2 groups, a work group and an advisory group. And they represent 9 disciplines. We have members from the US and Canada. We also have people that we invited specifically from the various life care planning training programs and other professional associations that have an interest in life care planning. So these are the committee members, and they have been doing a fabulous job. The work group are the ones that do the day-to-day work, and the advisory group is just what it sounds like. They offer us advice when we need it. They did a testing of a survey for us before we sent it out. They've been very valuable to us in providing support to the work group. This work group, we started out 18 months ago with 1 to 2 meetings a month, and several months ago we upped it to 3 meetings a month. And that's a huge commitment from all of these people that we really owe a debt of gratitude to. They've been very wonderful because there's also been homework between each of the meetings. So we're hoping that we can get this done before year end, and we'll talk more about the schedule in a moment. So during the first 3 months after we got the committee formed, we tried to gather information from a variety of sources that we thought should influence who or how the 4th edition gets structured. So we looked at all kinds of journals and texts and publications. We pulled up the journal issue that has the summit proceedings from the beginning of time. to now. We looked at research, we looked at educational programs, we looked a lot at the environment. There's a lot happening in the world we practice in that is influencing or trying to influence us, and wanted to be cognizant of that. And we also pulled all of the standards of practice from the various professionals who are doing life care planning, so that one, we could make sure we're not doing anything that will cause a conflict for any life care planner, but also there's a wealth of information and ideas by reviewing others' standards of practice and helping us decide how we want to reformulate the 4th edition. We did the survey last August and September, so a little more than a year ago, about 15 months ago, and the invitation to participate in that survey included all of the life care planners we could get our hands on through these various groups, and we did have about 135 respondents. If you recall that questionnaire, that survey, there was about 20 different questions. If you look at 135 respondents, each answering 20 questions, and they're open-ended essay kind of questions, not just yes, no things, that was a lot of comments. We had literally hundreds and hundreds of comments that the committee has processed every single one we have looked at. The committee's commitment to you had been that we would look at every single comment and consider it, that nothing was unworthy of being considered. We also committed to making changes only if they were objective, only if we could provide a sound foundation, so that it's not the opinion of the committee members, but the will of the field of life care planners. And we also wanted to stick to the principle of keeping the standards as general statements that still allow each individual practitioner to exercise their own judgment with their life care plans, and to allow for continued evolution of both the environment and internal practices, so that the standards don't have to be updated every year. So some of the important themes that came about when we were looking at all of the results was that the responses were reflecting more than just what you guys think about the standards. There was a lot of responses that reflected concern for practitioners in the field itself. I've got the graphic here of a circular firing squad, because honestly, that's what a lot of it seems to feel like as we were reading some of the responses. We have life care planners who think that standards of practice are generally useful. We had a lot of complimentary comments. However, we could see that that there was still some desire to have the document be a more efficient or thorough tool to help them handle some of the field-wide concerns. So we had to ponder how to consider these problems or issues that are occurring within the field. When we don't create standards, we articulate the standards that exist. So have we been articulate enough in our standards to address the concerns that people have? What are some of those major concerns that are reflecting disagreements? Do the current standards of practice contribute to those concerns? And then how can they help to become a better tool? So there's 3 different interprofessional issues that we identified as being really prominent in the responses that we were seeing. The first is this kind of a response: my profession is the best one, not yours. Or I don't have to listen to you or your opinions because my profession is right. And I am willing to market and to testify that I'm better and you're not. So there is that kind of issue that's going on amongst life care planners. The second category of interprofessional issues related to process. We had a lot of comments that said, I have a process. My process is the right way. don't bother me if it's not my process. I don't want to think about your process. My process gives me unlimited ability to form opinions about anything, and I don't need to collaborate. I can do things all by myself. And then the third area was that life care planners, as perceived by other life care planners, don't follow the standards of practice anyway. At least the way some people are thinking is that they believe, although they follow them, their colleagues don't. That when they're critiquing other life care planners, they're finding a lot of faults that they believe are related to not following the standards of practice. And there were people who put comments into the survey responses that reflected that the concept of general standards, so that you have the right for individual judgment on a particular case, means that they can carry that really far and interpret their standards however they need to fit the case, and that can be variable from case to case. We actually have people who said that standards aren't used much and that they don't apply to them. So there's that group of issues. So before we started talking about the individual changes that were being recommended, we thought we needed to look at how we could possibly address these issues within the field that are causing such problems. So we looked at the existing standards to see what we have that's relevant to those issues. We looked at all of the literature and the documents that we had collected over that 3-month period between the time the committee was convened and the survey results started coming in. We collected, I think, 150, 200 different documents that we have put in our library and have reviewed. We looked at adding language that would better define and elaborate and explain the concepts that are in the standards of practice, and that is something that was requested. We compared and contrasted the professional disciplines in their standards. We actually created a little chart that compared the different disciplines in their standards of practice and how they conduct their processes. And we got ideas on how standards can be formatted to illustrate the concepts that unite the professions. So what we found is that we already have a lot of the tools. We already have language in the current life care planning standards. We talk about professionals needing to practice within their scope of practice, that they have education and a training that allows them to perform independent assessments and make independent opinions. We have language about remaining within the scope of your profession. And we also had a lot of language about seeking collaboration. It's already there. We also looked at several new data sources to validate these standards. We've had very prolific amount of literature written in the past 6 years regarding scope of practice and standards, and we relied on that to help guide us as well. And what we learned as we did this review, and we created our little chart of how all of the professions compare to each other, is that every profession outlines a planning process. So for any one profession to say theirs is right because they have a process and you don't, is on its face incorrect. Every single professional that's doing life care planning has their own standards and have defined their own process. Now, we don't all use the same words, but we did find that we all use words that are similar. And you'll see the 5 bullet points here in green. The first one having to do with gathering data. We either examine, assess, evaluate, interview, test, or screen. We all have something in our standards for our professions that identify we're going to do that step. We also have some kind of diagnoses. There's different kinds of diagnoses, not just medical. There's nursing diagnoses, there's therapy diagnoses, there's psych diagnoses, and problem assessment. All of us also analyze and integrate and interpret and prognose. So we mull the information over in our heads and decide what's important, what's not important, what does it mean, how does it relate to each other, and we're all doing that. And then we all make plans. We all identify what we're trying to achieve, what kinds of interventions will help us get to what we want to achieve, and we implement that. And then lastly, all of the professions are doing some kind of evaluation. We're looking at the results, at what were the outcomes, and how do we measure progress and do follow-up. So we looked at these words and thought, what can we do to make these steps clearer in our standards of practice to show that we have a considerable amount of unity between the professions in how we approach doing the work of life care planning. So we spent a bit of time playing around with what the words were and should be for what the steps are for life care planning that we could use to provide a framework that's applicable to all life care planners. And a few slides from now, you'll see how we have implemented that in the new standards. And that, in combination with acknowledging that each profession has its own scope of practice and that we need to collaborate because no single profession knows everything about every other profession. We have to collaborate. We felt that that we have the information and the ability in the new standards to show that it's frankly incorrect for any discipline to claim higher legitimacy or a higher process or higher outcomes or being better inherently because of their profession than any other life care planner. So we have these tools to show we're on equal footing, and the challenge for the committee then became to how to demonstrate that and make that clear in the new standards. So the way we approached that then was to look at what else we could add. First of all, we've added some new sections to the standard. We have an entire section now just on scope of practice. We had used the term scope of practice several times in the 3rd edition and in prior editions, but we had never defined that or developed it so that people could understand it and operationalize it when approaching standards. We have also added the steps of the life care planning process, and we're correlating each step with the standards so that there is a clear delineation between doing all the steps and what is expected from us for doing those steps. And then we've completely reorganized the content of the document to better differentiate between standards of practice and standards of performance. So this slide is showing you on the left side what the table of contents was in the 3rd edition. The table of contents on the right side of your screen is what it's going to look like. It's not completely done yet, but this is what it's going to look like. And everything that's in red is new. So you can see that in the historical and current perspective that we have added language. We've created 2 entire new sections, one called Evolution of Standards, another called Scope of Practice. And then we have given a clearer definition, as you will see, on what standards of performance are, what does that mean, and identifying what those standards are, and then the standards of practice. And all of those steps in red, there's 9 of them. Those are the steps, and the corresponding standards will align with them to show what our standards of practice are for life care planning. So let's take a look at how that's going to look in the new standards. So first of all, where we had something new was in the historical perspective section, which is now called the historical and current perspective. We've added language to acknowledge that the roots of life care planning are in rehabilitation and economics, and that they don't belong to any single profession. We're also adding language to show that we're recognized internationally as a transdisciplinary specialty practice, again reinforcing that no single discipline can do this. We also added language that the development and adoption of standards is also a transdisciplinary process, and that there's a changing use of life care plans for many purposes, and that also influences how the standards are written and used. The new section, evolution of the standards, this is taken largely from the foreword of the 3rd edition. There was some content in there that we decided should be moved from being a foreword from the prior edition, and forewords change with each edition, and the old ones get lost. And there was some information in there that we didn't want lost. So this one explains, this new section now takes a lot of that information and explains how the standards are developed, where they come from, and how that development continues to elevate the standards. And that way it's now embedded into the standards document and memorializing it for future editions. It also gives us a visual model, which is sometimes easier for people to comprehend if they can kind of see it in a picture format. And it states that following standards is an expectation of life care planners, and acknowledges that failure to follow standards can have consequences. So this is the visual model. If you're familiar with the 3rd edition and including the foreword at the beginning of it, this will look familiar to you. This is simply identifying that to define our core knowledge, process, skills, and behaviors. We start out with the sources at the bottom and work through those to define the center core, and those flow into the standards of practice. And through all the arrows, we can see how those standards then help the profession to develop and develop other kinds of programming, from journals to research to credentialing, and how all of those feed back in then to the continued evolution of the standards. Then the next new section is on the scope of practice. So this section is drawing considerably on all of the life care planning literature that has been published in the last 5 or 6 years, that identifies the various disciplines and what their scopes of practice are, and what constitutes a qualified opinion from those professionals. Also, this section, it not only covers what their training is and their extra credentials and experiences, but it poses questions that each of us can use to help us self-assess whether the recommendations we are making are truly within our scope of practice, or if we're critiquing another life care planner's work, we can use those same questions to help us evaluate whether that life care planner practiced within their scope of practice. And we also put in some suggestions for how life care planners can show their personal scope of practice so that it's more transparent, more clear for others to see. So now to the standards themselves. All of that work took us several months, and yet at that point, we still hadn't addressed the standards themselves and started making changes with them. All of that work, which took us many months, was just reorganize, look at the kind of language we were going to use, add the new sections, and then we were finally ready to get to the nitty-gritty of looking at the many, many, many suggestions that came from the survey about specific suggestions to make. So first of all, we're going to address the standards of performance. And we added an explanation that says that standards of performance are intended to describe a competent level of skills and behaviors that may be expected. So you can look at these as the kinds of characteristics that life care planners possess, or the skills that they have. So it could be education, it could be the way they relate to other people, that they collaborate, that they act in an ethical manner. These are things that describe the performance of the life care planner. To date, we did not make any changes in the standards of performance in terms of adding new ones. We did not delete any. There were a few minor changes that were requested just to add clarity, but they didn't change the meaning of any of those standards of performance. So that was a group of standards that were left pretty much untouched from the 3rd edition. We did find, as we were reorganizing into the steps of life care planning, that some of the things that in the prior edition we had identified as standards of practice really were standards of performance. So we've moved some of them around to try and clean that up. So it may look somewhat different to you between the 3rd and 4th edition, but it really is pretty much the same content. So the standards of practice themselves, we've added a statement that say that these describe the authoritative process that's followed in life care planning. And that's a word that we wanted to emphasize because it's a word that a lot of life care planners emphasize is the validity and worthiness of their process. So we want to make it very clear that we have an authoritative process that we follow, that there is an organization of steps that we are expected to follow. And we also need to acknowledge that the top picture shows that the steps can be followed sequentially. However, in the course of doing a complete life care plan where there's a lot of moving pieces, it may look more like an Escher staircase. We may be working on a particular step and then we find it's beneficial to return to earlier steps or jump forward to an upcoming step, and that we're moving around them throughout the process of completing any particular life care plan. So it seemed to feel more like the Escher staircase, I think, by the time we finish one. But it is still all of the steps that have to be done. So the steps that we identified were these that are in red. We have 9 different steps, from beginning the casework, which we're calling case initiation, assessment and evaluation of the evaluee. Then we move to analysis and synthesis of all of the information that we've collected. The next step is that we are delineating what the future care recommendations are, whether it's coming from our own opinion or collaboration with others or other sources. The next step is that we are delineating costs or charges, that we then have the step of creating our work product. Then the last 2 steps are related to education of the consumers or users of life care plans. And finally, forensic application and preparation. At this point, I want to say the cost/charges. We have had many discussions on this over the years. I remember we had this same discussion back in doing the 3rd edition, is what language should we use in the standards of practice? Should we say cost? Should we say charge? We acknowledge that it depends on your perspective, whether you're the consumer or the provider, as to what you call it, and that the definition changes depending on your perspective. So to make it clearer, we turned to the definition of life care plan, and have noted that the definition of life care planning says that it identifies costs. So therefore, we decided just to keep it really clean and simple. And the standards for the 4th edition will simply use the word cost. You won't see the word charges. And by cost, we're referring to the cost that's noted in the definition of life care planning. So whether you're a purist in terminology and agree or not, we felt that we had to pick something and stick with it and have a rationale. So our foundation, our rationale is that's the word that's used in the definition of life care plans. So how will this look when we get into the new standards? First of all, for each of those steps, so if we go back to here, each one, this next sample is the 3rd step. Yes, so the 3rd one, case initiation, assessment, and then analysis. So when you're reading through the 4th edition, when you get to the step on the analysis and synthesis, it will give you a statement that identifies what that step means. And in the case of analysis and synthesis, it's a step referring to organizing collected data into an empirically derived and conceptually coherent template that incorporates case salient factors. That was the first draft that we had of this, and actually at our meeting a week ago, we made this a little simpler so people will understand it a little more easily. But basically, this is a description of what this step is about. And then we have taken all of the standards that currently exist and looked at what step do they go in. And some of the standards had to get split up. Some of them went fully into a particular step. And we then had to consolidate that and make everything look coherent and understandable. So for this step, there were a couple of different standards, and these will be familiar to you because these are the language that were are the words that were used in the 3rd edition. We have the standard statement, and then we have measurement criteria. So this will be very familiar to you, but now you can see that for each standard, it's tied to a specific step in our process to again show that we are going through every single step and we are all doing it similarly regardless of what our professional background is. So are the standards themselves changing or just the format? Most of the responses, thankfully, because that allowed us to go through them pretty quickly, were complimentary of the standards as they were written. We had a lot of requests to actually make no changes, but there were many, many requests for changes, and we considered every single one of them. A lot of them were simply word changes to add clarity, but the substance remains substantially the same. By reorganizing into the steps format, we could better see that there was some redundancies and gaps between the standards as written in the 3rd edition. So we were able to do some combining, and we also did some separating out and have some reiteration or clarification of maybe nuances between a particular standard as to how it's applied in one step versus another step. So you may see some of the old standards that have been split to fit better into more than one step. So what are we not changing for sure? First of all, we are not going to be creating a definition and standards for work products that are not life care plans. That was a request we received from multiple responses. It was also a request that we had received when we did the 3rd edition. And for those of you who've been around a while, you may recall that at one of our summits, that was a topic of discussion, and the practitioners in the field have determined that we are responsible for providing standards and guidance and education for life care plans. If it's not a life care plan, it's up to you what you call it. It's up to you what standards you apply to it. If it's not a life care plan, then it's not part of these standards of practice. And we're not going to, at this time, change to add into the scope of our authority or the scope of us as professionals by trying to create standards for other things besides life care plans. So for those of you who are really hoping to get more guidance and direction for things that are not life care plans, I'm sorry you're going to be disappointed, but please know that you have the ability to essentially create your own ideas of what should be or not be in anything that you're calling something other than a life care plan. We're also not changing the definition of the life care plan. There were just a couple of requests for us to make changes in the wording. However, as we discussed it and looked at it, we realized that that was a definition that was hammered out amongst a lot of different players in the field a long time ago, from different entities, not just within Iarp or IALCP, and that it was a collaborative definition created by a variety of entities that have an interest in life care planning, and that we felt that it should not be up to the 25 of us who were in the work group to make the changes in a definition that had been labored over extensively by such a vast group of people. So if there is a desire to change the definition of a life care plan, that is something that we would defer to the board of directors for the association to decide if there needs to be a work group convened to address that, but that it was really outside our scope in changing the standards of practice. It was outside our scope to define what a life care plan is. Some of the things that we felt are really important because of the kinds of comments that we got from a lot of responses is that we need to keep emphasizing certain things, that it's a continual education process and that it doesn't hurt to keep seeing and hearing and teaching these concepts over and over again, certainly because there's always new practitioners coming into the field, and we need to keep reminding ourselves life care planner is a role. It's not a profession. We don't have any authority to tell people that they can't be life care planners. We don't have an authoritative body that can mandate any particular credentials in order to practice as a life care planner, or to tell them to stop. Those are voluntary credentials. And the professions can mandate credentials for being a member of that profession, whether it's physician or nurse or therapist or psychologist or counselor, but we are a role, so we have very limited authority for being able to tell people what to do and how they identify themselves. So we always need to keep that in mind. We also really do need to learn each other's scope of practice. If we are doing a transdisciplinary practice, that means we have to have an awareness of what each other's scopes of practice are, so that we know who to turn to appropriately get recommendations that we can't make, and to evaluate whether someone else is making appropriate recommendations. So we need to have that awareness of what each other's scope of practice is. We also need to note that narrative reports are part of the life care plan. We had a couple of interesting comments about, oh, when did we restart requiring narrative reports? Why do you want to add that? We're not adding that. That's been there in prior editions. Yes, there are life care planners who may not do a narrative report. However, it has been part of the standards of practice for life care planning for many, many, many years. Certainly the third edition and the second edition, so it goes way back. It's not new. We also want to keep emphasizing that it's okay for life care planners to educate their referral sources, i.e. particularly attorneys, about our scope of practice and our standards of practice, so that we can use these tools about our scope and our standards to help them understand why we're making recommendations and why we may not necessarily be able to honor their desires and wishes to shape the final product of a life care plan that we submit. That we want to be able to use these standards as a tool to help show what we are supposed to be doing and not doing. So what's left before it's final? Well, we've been working on this now for 18 months. I am so grateful for the wonderful committee that we've had. As I said, we're meeting 3 times a month now, and you might think at this point that some people are getting sick of it, but everybody is happy when we come to the meetings, and we're enjoying this. This has been a fun process, and we're really excited to get this out to you. And we want to do it as soon as possible because we think that some of these changes are going to be so important for making life easier for many life care planners. So that's why we've been willing to increase to meet 3 times a month. And everybody has really been pitching in and doing it and showing up and really trying to get this done. So what do we still need to do? We're still doing some double checking on data sources to make sure that we have everything covered. We recently finished going through every single consensus statement. We've looked at a variety of different literature sources and the what's happening in the environment. We've gone through the documents in our library that we collected a year ago to see if we're considering the influence that anything should have on us. Then we're doing some simple things like cleaning up formatting and proofing for grammar and spelling errors. And we're almost ready to begin the field review process. We still have 2 more meetings here in the month of November. I am hopeful that by the time we complete our first of 3 meetings in December, that we will be ready to submit this for field review. And I will be contacting Mary Barrows-Bailey to help with this second dissemination. She's was our survey guru for the survey a year ago. To get this disseminated, we will send the invitation to participate in field review to the same groups that we did for the survey last year. And it will be a chance for all of you to look through and pick apart and analyze and consider the new document and make your feedback known to us before it becomes a final product. So then we will have to review all of that. The committee will have a breather while it's going through field review, and then we will be able to make those final changes. We haven't decided as a committee yet exactly how long field review will be. Typically it's a few months. I think it was the second edition that lingered on for way too long of a time. We're not going to do that. But maybe something in the neighborhood of 3 months, we'll see what the committee decides to do for how long field review will be open. And then depending on the quantity of feedback that we get and how easy the feedback is to process will really determine when we can do the final publication. We are cognizant that there is the summit coming up in May, and the focus of that will be on money, costs, charges, all of the controversies related to that. The white paper that was requested in 2017 is ultimately going to come out. We think that we have made sure that the wording related to determining costs for the life care plan is applicable, but still generalizable enough that whatever comes out of the summit will still fit. So I'm not sure that we need to wait for the results of the summit and keep delaying the 4th edition of the standards in order to accommodate whatever work comes out of that. But that's something that if we do see something come out of that summit, we may have to do a quick revision to the 4th edition in order to get the cost section in alignment with whatever it is that we come up with and decide to adopt. So that the final release of the 4th edition is still kind of up in the air, but I am hoping that we can get it to you by the end of the 1st quarter of 2022, but fingers crossed on that. And after it's final, it's going to be disseminated. We'll send it out to everybody that we can. And again, through the same avenues for the surveys that have gone out and the invitation to the field review. We especially want to make sure that all of the training programs have it, and we'll put forward a respectful request that training programs consider modifying their content to make sure that it's in alignment with the 4th edition. We also have other kinds of education that needs to be done as we've encountered information from the survey last year that reflected a lack of understanding or points that might be controversial about life care planning and our standards and our methodologies. We have been continually forwarding that to the board and to certain people who have done standards of practice education at our meetings in the past, and that we hope might want to do more of that so that we can keep providing education, particularly on how to apply standards into real life practice. One of the things that I do want to point out is on the 3rd edition, we chose to not update the section on the code of ethics because there had been a request to do something different with that. And we had just put the code of ethics as an appendix in the 3rd edition. What we've decided to do for the 4th edition is the code of ethics will not be part of this document at all. The board did decide to do a separate committee or work group for updating the code of ethics, and that will be a standalone document. I do not know who is in charge of that or what their status is. And so any of you who are listening now that might have some information that you can share on that, you can put that in the Q&A and Tanya can point that out to us, because I'm sure there's people who are interested in knowing what the status is on the code of ethics changes. And then I think we're, the committee, all going on a very needed vacation from this for a while. And then it'll be a few years and we'll begin all of this again. So time for questions. I think we have about 10 minutes.
First of all, and Karen, I don't know, you probably haven't been able to see the chat, but most of what's going on in the chat is people just basically saying, thank you for all of your hard work. This is going to be a huge asset. This is a gift to the life care planning community. More and more people are chiming in that way. So I want you to know that. Yay. There is one question pending, and there was one question that I answered when we were looking at the different disciplines early on in your early slides. One of the questions were rehab counselors or CRCs included in that discipline consideration, and they were. So I answered that.
Yes, we just generically called it counselors and did not specifically delineate rehabilitation counselors. But yes, we looked at counselor standards of practice and documents from that field.
And then the questions on the table now, how do other definitions of a life care plan fit with this standard of practice document?
What other definitions?
Well,
are there particular ones that people are interested in?
I'm going to let the person who asked that populate, and I'll come back to that. Let me see if there's something new in the chat. Okay. Okay. The Iarp Code of Ethics is being, this is from Laura, is being revised and will be sent to the sections to see if they want to develop addendum to the main Iarp Code of Ethics to reflect the section needs. This is in the work. So that's the status of the Code of Ethics.
Okay, good, Laura. Thank you for that. I knew Laura was involved, but I don't know if she's in charge of it. But Laura has had some communication with us, and we've given her access to our library and our organization so that the Code of Ethics group can draw upon other documents that we have collected and can look at our process for how we're revising the standards in case they want to adopt any of that methodology for their code revision. So I'm glad to know that that is ongoing. And did Laura say what kind of timeline there might be for that?
I don't see that yet. Can I double back to the question though about the life care planning definition? This is in reference to the ICHCC new definition of life care planning. I believe that is now removed from the website.
Oh, is it?
I could be wrong. I did a search again, so I know it was approved, as I understand it, in July of this year by the ICHCC Board of Commissioners. And if someone was involved in that who can provide more insight on that, feel free to type it here in the chat. I'm going on what I know.
Yeah.
So I believe that was in July. I know it was there as of last week, and it has been confirmed that it's been removed by ICHCC.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, I'm kind of glad to see that. That had been brought to my attention just a couple of weeks ago that ICHCC had decided to create a new and different one. And so there had been consideration of what kind of questions that would raise and what that means, and frankly, whether it was appropriate. I know Iarp, along with IALCP leadership, did send a letter requesting the ability to discuss that. So that's interesting that it's now been removed from the website, and I'll be curious to see what processes there are going forward about that.
Something else I just want to mention, Karen, and to everyone else who can't see these numbers, we have right now 130 people participating in this, which lets me know that this is really important for our community. So one, we could not be doing the work in the work groups, certainly without Karen, but also without the input from the community. So thank you so much to everyone who commented the first time. We pored over your comments thoughtfully, believe me, and we will do that in the second round of field review, but we really need everybody participating in field review. So this is my call out to all 130 of you plus to please do what you can in field review to help us move this along. Someone else had asked a question about when we anticipated it being released. I just said mid 2022, but that's going to depend on field review. So I had answered that.
Yeah, I hope it's not mid, because that sounds like June. I hope it's a whole lot earlier. The committee works. If you can get excited about standards, I don't know if that's saying a good thing about yourself or not, but I feel excited about this new product that we're creating, and that it really has the potential for making things a lot easier and clearer for us, and addressing some of these issues and some of the infighting that we've had. So we are so anxious to get this out and done, and that's going to influence how long the field review will be open. I'm sure, since the committee has been so wonderful about meeting multiple times a month to get it to this point that once we get those field review comments, we'll do that again, because we want to get this pushed through, not because we're getting sick of it, but because we're so excited about it and we want to get it out and in everybody's hands and be able to be used.
And probably in every one of our meetings, Karen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, almost all of us at some point will comment this. I will look forward to field review. I will look forward to what people say about this in field review. I mean, it really is valued.
Right, absolutely.
Okay, that answer has come through. Oh, someone else just made a good point that they were not contacted for field review. So if you're not, feel free to email me and we'll make sure your information is added to the list.
Yeah.
Comments.
Was that an individual person or representing an entity?
Just an individual person. So I've
Okay.
copied your email address and I'll make sure I send that to you.
Yeah, the field review isn't open yet, so you won't have been invited to field review. The survey that we did was 15 months ago, so it's too late for that. But we're accessing, of course, anybody who is an Iarp ALCP member will get a link to the field review opportunity. And we will also send that to all of the other organizations where life care planners live, whether it's through the training programs like FIG and Capital University and IRET, as well as the other associations. The nurse life care planners have been involved in this revision process. So the nurse life care planners, the legal nurse consultants, the email lists through ICHCC. So, you know, we're just looking for any way to get it out to anybody. So the person who made that comment, gosh, I hope that you're on somebody's email list or you're involved in some forum. You will get a invitation to participate in field review. But if you don't, then yes, contact Tanya or me and we'll take care of that.
Thank you all so much for attending. And this is, I'd love to see this many people. I love to see this many people participating here. And Karen, can't say thank you enough. Appreciate your leadership.
It has been my pleasure. This has been fun. And thanks to the committee and all of the life care planners who are participating.
All right, everybody. See you next time.
Bye.